The Senate's coming in for more work on President Trump's cabinet nominations. The next votes in the Senate will be on confirming Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence and on whether to advance RFK Jr. to be HHS Secretary. Those votes happening overnight at 12:30 a.m. Eastern unless there's a time agreement to hold them earlier. Live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Senate will come to order. Chaplain of the Senate, Dr. Black, will open the Senate with prayer.
Let us pray. Gracious God, who reveals yourself gloriously in the rising and setting of the sun, make us good stewards of your blessings. Lord, give us opportunities to help solve the problems in our world by using our minds to produce creative solutions. Inspire our senators. As they abide in your presence, make them receptive to your guidance. Fill their minds with insights and wisdom. Give them resiliency and courage. Today, provide them with the grace to think not of what they can get, but of what they can give. Empower them to practice conciliation without compromise. Lord, place your arms of protection around them and their families. We pray in your all-powerful name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Under previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii to be Director.
Mr. President,
I recognize the senator from Iowa.
sometime today, we're voting on the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard. She's going to be Director of National Intelligence after she's confirmed. Until she was nominated, I only knew her from seeing her in media sound bites and what other people wrote about her. She came to my office and we had a very good, very substantive conversation. I determined that she's very smart and obviously an articulate person. In our discussion, we covered many of her past statements on various policy matters, and she was able to clarify what the media got right and what the media got wrong. Obviously, since she served in the Congress of the United States as a Democrat, I and she may not agree on every policy. However, Representative Gabbard made clear that she does not see her position as Director of National Intelligence as a policy-making decision. She understands that President Trump is the one who was elected. As Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard's job will be simply to make sure that the intelligence community is able to provide the best, unbiased information to help President Trump make the proper decisions. She and I also spoke about some of my past oversight work regarding the intelligence community. I have had mixed results in getting legitimate information that I have sought, depending upon who was in that particular position. For instance, when Rick Grinnell became the acting Director of National Intelligence, I suddenly and surprisingly got material that I had asked for after being totally stonewalled by previous directors of national intelligence. Based on my conversation, I expect Tulsi Gabbard, along with CIA Director Ratcliffe, will ensure that the intelligence community will be forthcoming and fully responsible to Congress as we in Congress exercise our constitutional responsibility not only to pass laws and appropriate money, but to be a check on the executive branch of government to see that a president, whether that president's Republican or Democrat, faithfully executes the laws as required by the Congress of the United States. On another matter, yesterday, I took a minute or two to address the Senate to remind my other 99 senators, which I do not have to remind the members of the Senate Agriculture Committee, that our nominee for Secretary of Agriculture, Mrs. Robin Rollins, was voted out of committee unanimously. You would think then that if both Republicans and Democrats think that Mrs. Rollins is the proper person to be Secretary of Agriculture, that she would be quickly approved for that position unanimously here in the United States Senate, and maybe even be lucky enough to do one on a voice vote. Now, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that we're going to be sitting around the United States Senate today for several hours to see whether we're going to vote on Ms. Gabbard to be Director of National Intelligence, or we're going to have that disposed of very quickly and get down to work. But the people in this country send us to the United States Senate to actually do work. And when you're sitting around just waiting for a decision from the minority of when they're going to allow us to vote on this particular nomination or how we're going to handle Mrs. Rollins for Secretary of Agriculture, nothing is getting done. And we're wasting a lot of the taxpayers' time with a lot of important decisions that have to be made even after we approve all the members of the cabinet. I yield and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alster-Brooks.
Hello, everybody. This is Noir the Destroyer over here, and I'm just watching the chaos unfold. You've heard about Tulsi Gabbard, but some people say that she has ties with the Russians. Seems like a lot of them people got ties with the Russians nowadays, you know. Anyway, if something outrageous happens, or if I start getting pissed off, you might hear me make some comments. But otherwise, enjoy the show. While we have a moment of silence here, I'll have to make a couple comments of a person.
Senators are continuing work on President Trump's cabinet nominations. The next votes in the Senate will be on confirming Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence and whether to advance RFK Jr.'s nomination to be HHS Secretary. Those votes happening overnight at 2:30 a.m. Eastern unless there's a time agreement to hold them earlier. Other nominations in the queue for votes: Howard Lutnick to serve as Commerce Secretary, Brooke Rollins for Agriculture Secretary, and Kelly Loeffler to lead the Small Business Administration. And coming up this afternoon, a hearing on ways to modernize American healthcare by focusing on prevention, flexible insurance, and tech innovations. Health professionals and stakeholders will talk about the issues before the House Ways and Means Subcommittee on Health. That's live at 2 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3, C-SPAN Now, our free mobile video app, and online at cspan.org. Right now, here on C-SPAN 2, we're waiting for a senator to speak.
Waiting for us. Anyway, I just wanted to.
Adjusted net farm income has fallen by 43 billion, or 26%, to 138 billion in 2025. We are witnesses to historic volatility in the farm economy.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I've got on the bottom of the screen here, boycott the billionaires, protect Social Security, national labor strike. These are things to consider because you got to protect Social Security. I'm telling you, because if you don't protect Social Security, you're gonna have grandma and grandpa out on the street. I'm telling you, and yourself in the future. If you're a young person, hey, I used to be young. Now I'm not. Now I'm an old man. Amazing, I got here. Um, Don't let them pull the rug out from under you, man. Because they'll say, oh, you'll get more money in your check because you won't be getting money to take out for Social Security. Yeah, that might sound great whenever you're young and strong, but what if you're like me who got neck cancer and ended up getting disabled? That probably cut 10 years out of my working life. So now I just do this. Um, and with the way Elon Musk is going roughshod through all these departments and everything, it's uncool. It's not right. And if everybody going on a national strike and shutting down the daggum economy is the only way to get these oligarchs to get off our back uh, and to give us our due, by golly, that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to either have to suffer a little bit now and bring these guys to heel, or you're going to suffer a lot more later. And the farther down that slippery slope to oligarchy and dictatorship that you go, the harder it is to get back out of that quagmire. So really think about it. Anyway, I will shut up for now and go take out my garbage before that garbage man gets here. So, talk in a bit.
Experienced extreme and unpredictable weather disasters. Inflation, supply chain disruptions, and international conflicts are also to blame for rising input costs that cut into the already thin margins that we operate
I
under.
forgot to turn the sound
The farm
back on.
economy is at a crossroads.
Oops.
For perspective, my husband's grandmother passed away 2 years ago, and we came across receipts and invoices from his Grandpa Schwartner while cleaning out her house. On these receipts, Grandpa Schwartner sold his cotton for 63 cents per pound. Just 2 weeks ago, we were quoted 58 cents per pound. That's 5 cents less per pound than 60 years ago. Yet in that same time, we have seen application costs increase by more than 300.
Mr. President, this week, the Senate will consider the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. President Trump has tapped Mr. Kennedy to lead the charge in making America healthy again, something that's been a concern of Mr. Kennedy's throughout his career. And Mr. Kennedy promises to make HHS a collaborative, transparent, and science-driven agency under his leadership. And I will say, Mr. President, that that's good to hear. Many Americans' trust in health authorities has eroded in recent years, with the pandemic being a big factor. A lot of Americans grew frustrated with confusing and sometimes contradictory guidance from government agencies. And measures like requiring toddlers as young as 2 years old to wear masks indefinitely not only defied common sense, there was no scientific research to back it up. Mr. President, our public health agencies do critical work, and I'm a supporter of their research, and I'm proud of the contributions that they make to American leadership in medicine and innovation. But if we're going to make America healthy again, the agencies doing this important work have to rebuild some trust with Americans. So I was pleased to hear Mr. Kennedy pledge to increase transparency and accountability, including an unprecedented level of collaboration with Congress that allows for regular and robust oversight of his agency's activities. I was also pleased that Mr. Kennedy acknowledged the importance of vaccines and the concerning reality that vaccine uptake in this country is decreasing. Mr. Kennedy has pledged that he will maintain the best vaccine standards. And he's committed to work within existing vaccine approval and monitoring systems and maintain the FDA's review standards. Mr. President, I look forward to Mr. Kennedy being a partner to Congress on some very important issues. He's brought attention to America's chronic disease epidemic. And I'm pleased that he wants to put a focus on chronic diseases that affect too many Americans and cost far too much in lives lost and dollars spent. I'm also encouraged that he is committed to implementing President Trump's pro-life policies at HHS. President Trump has been one of the most pro-life presidents we've ever had. Mr. Kennedy's agency will be critical in protecting life and supporting mothers and babies. Mr. Kennedy is also committed to working with farmers and ranchers on policies that affect our food supply. America's farmers and ranchers are a valuable resource, and I look forward to working with him to ensure that the voice of South Dakota's agricultural producers is heard. Mr. President, I believe that Mr. Kennedy's collaborative approach to this job will help restore some of the trust in our public health agencies that's been lost in recent years. And I look forward to working with him on a number of issues as we restore that trust and work to make America healthy again. Mr. President, before I close, I just want to highlight the nominations process that we're having here in the United States Senate. Mr. Kennedy's confirmation will be the 15th since President Trump's inauguration. Democrats are obviously trying to slow down the process, but we've been moving right along. And we will continue to maintain an aggressive pace until President Trump has his entire team in place. Mr. President, it's interesting that Democrats have saved some of their fiercest opposition for two of our nominees this week, Mr. Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard, who, interestingly enough, are both former Democrats. I wonder if Democrats are unhappy to see the elevation of two individuals who became disillusioned with the Democrat Party. I think most Americans are pleased to see President Trump have a diversity of backgrounds in his cabinet. In fact, it's not uncommon. President Bush's first cabinet included a Democrat. President Obama's had two Republicans. President Trump elevated an Obama appointee to his first cabinet. But this trend stopped with President Biden. I'm sure the American people are glad to see President Trump living up to his promises to be a president for all of America. It's up to Democrats whether they want to participate or just obstruct for the next few years. But Republicans will be working to deliver results that benefit all Americans. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
It's also Brooks.
Senators are continuing work on President Trump's cabinet nominations. The next votes in the Senate will be on confirming Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence and on whether to advance RFK Jr.'s nomination to be HHS Secretary. Those votes happening overnight at 12:30 a.m. Eastern, unless there's a time agreement to hold them earlier. Other nominations in the queue for votes: Howard Lutnick to serve as Commerce Secretary, Brooke Rollins for Agriculture Secretary, and Kelly Loeffler to lead the Small Business Administration. And coming up this afternoon, a hearing on ways to modernize American healthcare by focusing on prevention, flexible insurance, and tech innovations. Health professionals and stakeholders will discuss the issue before the House Ways and Means Subcommittee on Health. That's live at 2 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3, C-SPAN Now, our free mobile video app, and online at cspan.org. Right now, here on C-SPAN 2, we're waiting for a senator to speak.
We have increasingly limited access to crop protection tools with few replacement under development. For those who export, we face great uncertainty in foreign markets. In our domestic markets, competition is rising from imports and significantly lower production costs. Hurricanes, drought, and other severe weather occur with increasing frequency. Although USDA has dramatically improved its ability to provide ad hoc assistance to our growers, we need Congress to enact a comprehensive bipartisan bill that invests in long-term competitiveness of our industry. Our proposal for the Farm Bill include new funding for research and development, incentives for technology that supplement and enhance human labor, resources to make our operations more resilient to extreme weather, and common sense changes to the crop insurance that would provide the majority of our growers with a functional safety net for the very first time. I don't have the time to walk through each of these proposals in my testimony, but we have submitted written testimony for record, which includes a copy of our 2023 recommendations. We will provide updated recommendations to you in the coming weeks. The Alliance stands ready to work with each of you on the next Farm Bill. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Mr. Talley, thank you very much. Now, Mr. Wurtzel, you are recognized. Please begin when you're ready.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Craig, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today in front of the House Ag Committee. I'm Rodney Weinzierl. I serve as Executive Director of the Illinois Corn Growers and the Illinois Corn Marketing Board, but I also grow corn and soybeans in rural Stamford, Illinois, and I'm here today as a farmer. I have farmed for the last 26 years, following my father, my grandfather on the same plot of land, farming for the same landlord family since 1912. My wife and I began transitioning our farm to our oldest daughter, Gracie, and this process has highlighted the challenges facing the next generation of family farmers. Today, the farm economy is struggling. I believe two fundamental issues are driving the downturn: lack of demand and rising input costs. Regarding demand, an Illinois farmer's first priority is to derive profit from the market, not from the government. To that end, we consistently invest in and advocate the U.S. government invest in the development of three major markets: livestock, ethanol, and exports. Last year's House Committee Farm Bill included an increase in funding for foreign market development and the market access programs, targeting demand growth from international buyers. Investment here could be very impactful to the ag economy as we face the fifth consecutive annual trade deficit in 7 years. Export markets generate demand and profitability. Given more time, I would love to dive into the opportunities available for family farmers if the U.S. built a vibrant, high-octane, cleaner burning fuel standard, which would allow the sale of more corn-based ethanol. Growing demand here would drastically impact the profitability proposition for the U.S. corn farmer. The second issue, input costs rose during a period of high commodity prices and have not yet returned to levels to allow family farmers to be profitable. My financials over the past 26 years reflect on two opportunities for the committee: crop insurance and transparency in input costs, particularly fertilizer costs. I struggle to understand how nitrogen costs have risen dramatically over the past years, despite the relatively stable price of the primary feedstock, natural gas. I understand that we operate in a global market and that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created supply challenges. However, throughout my career, the fertilizer industry has twice had the opportunity.
I recognize the Democrat leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, in his first 3 weeks in office, Donald Trump has waged a scorched-earth campaign against the rule of law. Now, we all know Donald Trump, of course, won the election last November. And as we all know, he campaigned on a platform to cut back large parts of the government. But nothing in the Constitution, nothing in our grand tradition of American separation of powers allows Donald Trump to break the law in order to achieve those goals. Let me repeat that. Nothing. Donald Trump campaigned on cutting back the government. That's true. But he is not allowed to break the law to achieve those goals. That is not how America works. You campaign, put your ideas forward. In this case, Donald Trump won. But he did not campaign on breaking the law, and the American people don't want him to break the law. The reason we have a system of checks and balances is so that even when one side wins an election, there's a check, There's a balance. That's what America's been all about for over 200 years. And at this point, Donald Trump is trying to break that tradition, area after area after area. And so, courts have begun to speak. And their message is very simple. The law is not optional, not even for a president of the United States. Yesterday, at least 5 rulings were handed down in federal courts against the president's brazen conduct in office. Court rulings against his attempt to freeze trillions in federal funding at OMB. Court decisions against his heartless, cruel decision to stop billions in medical research funding through the NIH. Courts ruled against his unlawful attempt to hollow out the federal workforce regardless of the job they do. To be sure, these decisions, these 5 decisions and many others like it, I think there are over 50, are all temporary, preliminary, and it's one step in a long process that will play out in federal court. But the trend is clear. Donald Trump is not free to bulldoze his way through the rule of law. Donald Trump is not free to bulldoze his way through the rule of law. He is an executive, not a monarch. He swore an oath faithfully to execute the duties of his office. And when the courts speak, Donald Trump must accept their judgments and honor the Constitution. Now, there are some on the hard right who think Donald Trump should ignore the courts. Even the vice president seems to suggest the courts can't, quote, control the powers of the executive. With respect to the vice president, the issue here isn't the courts trying to control the president. It's the president trying to control the law. He wants to decide for himself what the laws are, which ones should be applied, which ones shouldn't, what they mean. Congress makes the law, courts interpret the law. We all learned that in grade school. That's how checks and balances work in a constitutional republic. Donald Trump does not reign supreme. When the courts speak, the president must adhere to their judgments. That is what his oath demands. The courts will be an important venue for holding Donald Trump accountable whenever he breaks the law and breaks his promise to the American people. It's one tool in the toolkit for how Democrats and all Americans who care about the rule of law will make sure that Donald Trump does not break the law and do just what he wants. Our courts will be just one resource of several, but they will be among the most important. And, as we've already seen, they're a critical front in the struggle to uphold the rule of law and prevent America from sliding into utter lawlessness. On the shutdown, in 5 weeks, funding for the federal government will run out. Let us remember, when there is talk about a shutdown, Trump and Republicans are already shutting down large parts of the government. Democrats do not want a government shutdown. It's the Republicans who are in charge. It's their responsibility to avoid a shutdown. The idea that Democrats want to shut down is laughable. Republicans who say this should look in the mirror. Let me repeat. When there's talk about a shutdown, Republicans are already shutting down large parts of the government. Democrats do not want to shut the government down. It's the Republicans who are in charge. It's their responsibility to avoid a government shutdown. Since the inauguration, unfortunately, President Trump and Republicans have been actively working to shut down parts of the government entirely on their own. They've shut down funding to CHCs. They shut down funding for research institutions, shut down exports for farmers, shut down protections for consumers, fired government watchdogs. Republicans are making plans to force Medicaid work requirements on Americans, even with disabilities, who can't work. They're making plans to harm Social Security recipients. They're trying to cut any sort of oversight so that corporations can run rampant. Nobody, unfortunately, is working harder right now to shut down the government, Donald Trump, congressional Republicans. Nobody working harder to shut down the government than Donald Trump and congressional Republicans. Now on 2 upcoming nominations. This week, Senate Republicans will force 2 nominees through the Senate that they know perfectly well do not merit confirmation. But Republicans, it seems, are going to confirm them anyway, because Donald Trump is strong-arming them into submission. Last night, 52 Republicans voted to advance the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to serve as Director of National Intelligence. By now, there is no question about whether or not Ms. Gabbard is qualified to lead America's intelligence agencies. By every objective measure, she is not. How could they choose, of all the people who might be available to do this job, how could President Trump choose her? The Director of National Intelligence must be fluent in the truth above all. The intelligence, by its own definition, is a fact-gathering agency. It depends on facts. But instead of speaking fact and truth, Ms. Gabbard repeatedly speaks the language of falsities and conspiracy theories. The Director of National Intelligence must be strong against America's adversaries. But Ms. Gabbard has spent her entire career sympathizing with the likes of Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad. On the night that Russia invaded Ukraine and launched the first full-scale invasion of a sovereign nation in Europe since World War II, what was Ms. Gabbard doing? Spending her energy blaming NATO and the U.S. for what Putin did. Putin invades Ukraine. Gabbard blames the U.S. for Putin invading Ukraine. How can we put this kind of person as head of DNI? That alone should be disqualifying for anyone seeking to become the top intelligence advisor to the President of the United States. When Ms. Gabbard had the opportunity to repair her image before the Senate Intelligence Committee and ease the deep worries of senators on both sides of the aisle, we all know a load of the Republicans on the Intelligence Committee felt she doesn't belong in office. But what did Ms. Gabbard do? She only exacerbated those worries. Senate Republicans know very well that she has no business advising the president on matters of classified intelligence. They know her judgment is off the mark, way off the mark. They know her troubling history of pushing conspiracies and spreading propaganda. So, deep down, this nominee is really about one very simple question. What do Senate Republicans care more about? Doing the right thing for national security, for American national security, or doing what is necessary to keep Donald Trump happy, even when they know how badly he is wrong? The American people will know the answer later tonight after the Senate votes on the Gabbard nomination. And after that, we'll move to another equally unqualified nominee. It's a parade of unqualified nominees. Robert Kennedy Jr. is nominated to serve as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. To state the obvious, the very, very obvious, putting a very wealthy, vaccine skeptic and conspiracy theorist in charge of America's public health would put every single American at danger. Mr. Kennedy is neither a doctor, nor a scientist, nor a public health expert, nor a policy expert of any kind. In fact, he is the face of the modern anti-vaccine movement. And he has spread other outrageous claims, like saying antidepressants cause mass shootings, or that AIDS might not be caused by HIV, or that COVID spared certain ethnic groups. RFK has not made a living by promoting public health, but rather by actively fighting it. Actively fighting it. Is RFK really who Republicans want running HHS? Again, the same question with Ms. Gabbard. Of all the people in America, how did they end up choosing him? How did Donald Trump end up choosing him? Once again, an agency that depends on science, evidence, and impartiality to ensure the health of over 330 million Americans. That vote, the vote on RFK, is about one simple question. One simple question. Will Republicans do the right thing for American public health, or will they do whatever is necessary to keep Donald Trump happy, no matter how misguided he is? The American people will know the answer to this very soon also. I yield the floor.
I recognize the senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I just heard Senator Schumer, the minority leader, say that Democrats don't want a government shutdown. Well, I would recommend that the minority leader actually ought to read the newspaper. He's going to see that Democrats are threatening and actually calling for a shutdown of the U.S. government. So here's USA Today today. Picture of Senator Schumer right there. Big picture in color, fist in the air. Democrats open to shutting down government. So the senator that just was on the floor saying, oh, no, they don't want it. He's calling for it across the country in the USA Today this morning. That's what we're seeing across this country. Democrats so much in disarray after the fact that they've lost the House, lost the Senate, lost the White House, that the Democrats now want to shut down the government. Here's a headline in the New York Times on Sunday. Democrats hint at government shutdown to stop Trump's axing at federal agencies. President Trump's doing what people elected him to do, to get the wasteful Washington spending to end. That's so we've seen USA Today, New York Times. What about the Washington Post? The Democrats say they will not help avert a shutdown. Democrats are calling for a shutdown. USA Today, New York Times, Washington Post, the list goes on. What are Democrats saying on television? Well, Meet the Press this Sunday. Senator Andy Kim, New Jersey. He said Democrats in Congress would shut down the government. He says if we have to, in order to obstruct President Trump. Not to help the country, not to provide services for the men and women in uniform, not to provide needs around the country. No, because they want to obstruct President Trump. That's why Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are calling for a government shutdown. Didn't end there. Cory Booker, New Jersey, a member of the leadership of the Democrat Party. He was on CNN this weekend. What did he say? Democrats will use every tool possible to stop President Trump.
Good. I hope they do.
The Democrats want to stop the president who was elected with 312 electoral votes, won every one of the battleground states, and the Democrats just want to stop him. The American people want the kind of action and the urgency that we're seeing right now out of President Trump. Jeff Merkley, senator from Oregon, he's open to shutting down the government. He said, oh, yeah, no more business as usual. Shut it down. President Trump is doing exactly what America voted for. But here are the headlines, there are the pictures, and those are the Democrats in the United States Senate saying, we don't care what the American people say, we're going to shut down the government. President Trump is shrinking the size of government. We know the government is too big. We know it spends too much. President Trump is accounting for every single penny. And we're not going to make pennies anymore as a result of the fact that it costs 3 cents to make a penny. The Democrats want to shut down the government.
Wow.
They don't like the success that America is having today. They don't like the optimism that is pervasive throughout our country.
Propaganda.
So once again, if there's going to be a shutdown, we're talking about a Schumer shutdown of our country because they lost the election. Additionally, Mr. President, here we are on the floor of the Senate, and the Senate will vote soon on the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence. But she has the right background. She has the right experience, and she has the right perspective to keep our nation safe and to keep it secure. Congresswoman Gabbard has served in uniform for more than 20 years. She deployed to the Middle East several times. She serves in the military today and was recently promoted to lieutenant colonel. As a member of Congress for 8 years, she served on the Armed Services and the Foreign Affairs Committee. Her experience handling highly classified information is extensive.
That's the problem.
As Director of National Intelligence, she will handle classified information properly and lawfully.
Yeah,
Congresswoman Gabbard is more than qualified to serve as the Director of National Intelligence. Now, we've heard a lot of debate about her. Not one senator has disputed the simple fact that she took a hard line on Russia and on Iran. In 2013, Congresswoman Gabbard co-sponsored the Nuclear Iran Prevention Act. She wanted severe sanctions on Iran. Well, why would the Democrats not like that? Oh, because they were part of the group with President Obama who wanted to appease Iran. No wonder they oppose her now. She opposed the Iran deal. She viewed it as a threat to both America and to Israel. And she was right. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. President Obama rejected sending tank-busting missiles to Ukraine. Remember what he sent? He sent blankets. Blankets. The sanctions that he imposed, President Obama imposed against Russia, were terribly weak. Congresswoman Gabbard argued for U.S. military assistance to Ukraine back then, and she called for painful sanctions against Russia, things that the Democrats and their President Obama at the time were unwilling to do. Tulsi Gabbard never sought war with Russia, yet she never kidded herself, never would look back about the aggressive nature of Russia's ambitions. She worked to stop wars, even though she served and was ready to fight in them. She knows what it means when we talk about peace through strength. Democrats attacked her patriotism. They attacked her loyalty. It's disturbing. No evidence to support that. The attacks on her are another case of Democrats equating political disagreement with disloyalty. Washington wants to trust our intelligence agencies again. We need to take an axe to the weaponization of these very agencies. Congresswoman Gabbard will keep politics out of intelligence gathering. She wants to return ODNI to its original size, its scope, its mission. As she wrote in Newsweek, I promise to provide unbiased, timely, and accurate intelligence for those making decisions to protect the people of our country. That's exactly what we need, Mr. President. Tulsi Gabbard is the right choice to be the Director of National Intelligence, and I look forward to voting to confirm her later today. Now, Mr. President, on a different matter, one critically important in my home state of Wyoming. Under the Constitution, most decisions affecting our lives are meant to be made at the local or the state level. But for decades, unelected, unaccountable, heavy-handed federal bureaucrats have taken away decisions from the states. They've centralized power and ignored the local experts. We need to put the power back into the hands of the people and the states. That's where it belongs. That's what our founding fathers envisioned. And a perfect example of this is the status of grizzly bears in Yellowstone National Park. The Yellowstone population of grizzly bears has been fully recovered. It's put on the endangered species list years and years ago, but it's been fully recovered for more than 20 years. In Wyoming, we've invested more than $50 million in this effort to make sure that the grizzly bears did fully and safely recover. Both Democrat administrations and Republican administrations have taken action to take the grizzly bear off of the endangered species list. Wyoming has a strong, proven track record of science-based management of the bears. Today, grizzly bears in Yellowstone, they are thriving. They're thriving so much that they're now doing great damage to our livestock and to our wildlife. In 2022, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said that there was, quote, substantial scientific or commercial information to warrant local control. Not the heavy hand of Washington, but local control. Yet the grizzly bear remains under Washington's control, and that is despite the best data and our state's success. This issue isn't science, it's politics. There are partisan liberal judges who refuse to listen to scientific evidence. The evidence shows that the grizzlies are fully recovered. The previous administration didn't want to give up control. Kind of how the Biden administration did it. So on its way out the door, final weeks, it threw sand in the gears of change. The Biden administration rejected, midnight hour, Wyoming's good faith efforts and management plans They did it just before leaving office. The decision was wrong. It was wrong for the grizzly bear population, and it was wrong for the people of Wyoming. It's time for Wyoming, not Washington, to be in charge of managing the grizzly bears. In Congress, Senator Cynthia Lummis and Congresswoman Harriet Hageman and I introduced legislation to delist the grizzly bears. Our legislation would restore state management. It would put power back into the hands of the people who understand the situation the best. We're also working with the Trump administration to take immediate action. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum is a supporter of delisting the grizzly bears. He agrees that local communities and states should be in control of these decisions. As he said in his confirmation hearing, there's a belief that when they come off of federal protection, that they're unprotected. No, he said, they're managed, as they are all of the other species in the state, by the locals who've got the closest data. Secretary Burgum is right, and I'm glad that we finally have an administration that is ready to work with the people of Wyoming. So I'm going to continue to work closely with the Secretary of Interior on a path forward that allows the people of Wyoming to make decisions for Wyoming. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Democrats, if they want to shut down the government, it wouldn't be on account of they lost the election. It'd be on account of what Trump is trying to do now that he won. I mean, there's a lot of MAGA voters who are.
I recognize the senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following detailees in the Senate Judiciary Committee be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the 119th Congress: Allison Kent and Dorothea Lay.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I listened to my colleague and friend from Wyoming, and I'm struggling to understand his point of view. He announced at one point that the Republicans were in the majority in the House and Senate. Well, that's a fact. I know it, you do as well. And so to say that you're in majority suggests that you're in charge, and it also suggests that if there's going to be a budget for the United States government, which we need next month, the majority party in both the House and the Senate has that responsibility to come forward with the budget. That's a simple fact of life, fact of political life. To blame the minority for no budget is to ignore the obvious. The majority of votes in the House and the Senate belong to the Republican Party. If there's going to be a budget, it is fair to assume that they would have to lead in that effort. I look forward to seeing that leadership. We've seen precious little of it so far. Mr. President, on a completely separate note, I realize that the president made these statements during the course of his campaign, but it still came as something of a shock when the first day of his presidency, Donald Trump decided to issue a blanket pardon for those who had been convicted for the January 6th riot that took place in this building. For those of us who were physically present, it's a moment we'll never forget. The Vice President of the United States was sitting in your chair, presiding over the United States Senate as we addressed the constitutional responsibility of counting the electoral votes. It was roughly 10 minutes after 2 o'clock in the afternoon when someone came along in a suit, walked up to the Vice President of the United States, grabbed him by the arm and pulled him off of the chair. Those of us who were here wondered what was going on. Well, we could hear the demonstrators outside, but we didn't understand why the Vice President was being removed from this chamber. A member of the Capitol Hill Police then walked up to where you're sitting and announced that this was going to be a safe room. Yes, there were demonstrators outside, even some in the building, but stay here. The Senate chamber will be a safe room. And be prepared for others to come into this safe room to avoid any conflict with the demonstrators. That instruction lasted for about 10 minutes. And then the same officer came up and stood before us and said, change of plans. Everybody evacuate this room as quickly as possible. We all headed out that door, going to another building on Capitol Hill that we thought might be safer away from the demonstrators. Think about that, Mr. President. The Capitol of the United States of America, taken over by demonstrators. The United States Senate and House of Representatives stopped in progress of doing their constitutional responsibility of counting the electoral votes. And we've seen the videotapes. Oh, there are plenty of them that show these mob demonstrators breaking the windows to get into the Capitol building, knocking down the doors, and then beating up on the police officers. Mr. President, when you and I came to work this morning, there were men and women, some in uniform, others in plain clothes, standing in the corridors of this building. Their responsibility is to keep us safe and to keep those who visit this Capitol safe. They are prepared, many of them have to be prepared to risk their lives to do it. And to think what they went through on January 6th is outrageous. They were beaten up by these mobsters, these thugs, these demonstrators who were egged on by the President of the United States to come up and go wild in the United States Capitol. Oh, they went wild, spraying bear spray into the face of individual policemen, beating up on them with poles and pieces of furniture. Yes, it was a pretty wild occasion, and it was a criminal occasion, and it led to the most extensive criminal prosecution in the history of our country. Some 1,600 people were prosecuted for their conduct on January the 6th. And I will tell you, as someone who witnessed that and went through that experience, they deserved it. It just strikes me as outrageous. If you heard on the news this afternoon that the Houses of Parliament in London had been invaded by a mob, they had beaten down the doors of the House of Commons and took control of it, you would have said that's impossible. That doesn't happen in a civilized country like England. It certainly shouldn't happen in the United States, and it did. I witnessed it. And then came the President of the United States on his first day in office, and what did he do? He decided that every single person arrested for a crime related to January 6th should be released with a full and unconditional pardon. And that's what he did. I asked my staff, let's keep track of these people and see what happened to them in the 3 weeks that have passed since the president made that decision. There's some interesting stories, sad stories. Emily Hernandez pleaded guilty to entering and remaining in a restricted building or grounds in relation to her actions on the Capitol on January 6. This Hernandez was seen holding a stolen, broken nameplate of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She served 30 days in federal prison and was released. Days after being pardoned by President Trump. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a 2022 deadly drunk driving crash in Missouri, during which she collided with a couple, Victoria and Ryan Wilson, who just left dinner celebrating their 15th wedding anniversary. Victoria died in the crash and Ryan sustained serious injuries. Then there's Daniel Ball. Daniel Ball was arrested for throwing, quote, an explosive device that detonated upon at least 25 officers and forcefully shoving police at the Capitol on January 6th. Daniel Ball was in possession of a gun and ammunition as he came into the Capitol, which was illegal considering his criminal background. The Department of Justice dismissed Ball's charges following President Trump's pardon. I have a long list here, and I'm not going to read them all, but there's one in particular, released with a full pardon by President Trump for the January 6 crimes he committed. Guy Reffitt, the first defendant to stand trial on charges related to January 6 Capitol insurrection, was sentenced to 87 months in prison for bringing a firearm into the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Reffitt's 19-year-old son, Jackson, turned him into law enforcement after the attack. Jackson also indicated that Reffitt had threatened to shoot him and his sister Peyton if they reported him to authorities. After receiving a pardon from President Trump, Guy Reffitt attended Kash Patel's Senate Judiciary Committee nomination hearing. Kash Patel is President Trump's nominee to be the director and head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Reffitt attended that committee nomination, and here's what he posted on social media afterwards. Remember, a man who was released after he was full pardon, after he was convicted of bringing a firearm into the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Certainly not a casual tourist by any means. Here's what he said on the social media, quote, present and in support of Kash Patel, as the leftist commies continue to spew lies, misinformation, and disinformation. My man, clean house cash, end of quote. So he certainly seems like he learned his lesson, right? Served time in jail, released with a pardon by the president. He's at it again, defying the authorities, defying anyone who disagrees with him politically. Full unconditional pardon from Donald Trump. The reason I wanted to make a note of Mr. Refett's history is that it's apropos of what I'm going to speak to this morning. Mr. President, this Thursday, the Senate Judiciary Committee is scheduled to consider whether to recommend Kash Patel's nomination to be Director of Federal Bureau of Investigation to the full Senate for consideration. So far, my Republican committee colleagues have chosen to ignore the myriad red flags about Mr. Patel, especially his recurring instinct to threaten retribution, political retribution, against his and President Trump's perceived enemies. This is a dangerous characteristic for a person who wants to lead the nation's most powerful domestic investigative agency, the FBI. I hope that what I reveal today from credible whistleblowers at the highest levels will give my Republican colleagues some pause before it's too late. Multiple whistleblowers have disclosed to my staff highly credible information indicating that Mr. Kash Patel has been personally directing the ongoing purge of senior law enforcement officials at the FBI. Let me remind you, Mr. President, Mr. Patel at this moment in time is not on any public payroll, nor does he have any authority by our government. Listen, on the morning of January 29th, the day before Kash Patel's confirmation hearing, there was a meeting between the acting leadership of the Department of Justice and the FBI. Notes from that morning meeting read, KP wants movement at FBI, reciprocal actions for DOJ. Let me say that again, quote, notes from the meeting, KP wants movement at FBI, reciprocal actions for DOJ. Acting Deputy Attorney General Emil Bove told the participants in this meeting that he had received multiple calls from the White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller the night before. Miller had pressured him because Kash Patel, KP, wanted the FBI to remove targeted officials faster, as DOJ had already done with prosecutors. The list of officials identified for termination was in the possession of a group of individuals who, according to our sources, were personally interviewed by Mr. Patel to be on what was known as the Director's Advisory Team. This advisory team at the FBI is a group of political appointees who were brought in to prepare for Mr. Patel's arrival. FBI leadership understanding of the advisory team's list was that, quote, a lot of names were people in the crosshairs. According to my whistleblower sources, Mr. Patel is receiving information from within the FBI from the Director's Advisory Team. Mr. Patel then provides direction to Stephen Miller, who relays it to the acting Deputy Attorney General Bove. It is unacceptable for a nominee with no legal or current role in government to personally direct the unjustified and potentially illegal firings of dedicated, nonpartisan professionals at the FBI. If these allegations are true, then Mr. Patel may have committed perjury before the Senate Judiciary Committee. The day after the meeting I described, where Mr. Patel's desire for FBI officials to be fired more quickly was discussed, was Mr. Patel's confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee. So the morning after, he's putting the heat on the leadership at the FBI to dismiss more people more quickly. He testifies before the Judiciary Committee under oath. During the hearing, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey asked Mr. Patel, and I quote, are you aware of any plans or discussions to punish in any way, including termination, FBI agents or personnel associated with Trump investigations? Yes or no? End of quote. Mr. Patel answered that he was, quote, not aware of that, and continued, quote, I don't know what's going on right now over there, but I'm committed to you, Senator, and your colleagues that I will honor the internal review process of the FBI, end of quote. Yet, if these whistleblower allegations are true, Just 2 days before, Stephen Miller, at Mr. Patel's direction, had ordered DOJ leadership not just to terminate a specific list of officials, but to speed up those terminations. Mr. Patel seems to be unable to wait for Senate confirmation to carry out retribution against his perceived political enemies. Patel is a private citizen today, and he was when he testified. No current role in government directing baseless firings of career public service. This speaks directly to the fact that Mr. Patel is not fit to be entrusted with government authority, which is evident to anyone who has seriously reviewed his record. And let me remind you, Mr. President, he is not seeking a term of 2 years or 4 years, but 10 years as director of the FBI. The ramifications of these terminations at the FBI are dangerous. They go way beyond Mr. Patel's fitness for office, because these terminations have greatly weakened the FBI's ability to protect the country from national security threats and have made America less safe. This hollowing out of one of the major law enforcement agencies of the federal government by the new Trump administration is at the risk of making America more dangerous and people in America more vulnerable to criminal and terrorist elements. Among those who were removed so far by the Trump administration are the top officials who oversee the FBI's work combating international and domestic terrorism. Think about that. The Trump administration starts off by going to the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigations. It comes up with a political list, and among those people who are eliminated are the people in charge of combating international and domestic terrorism, cybersecurity threats, human and drug trafficking, and violent crime. Does that make us any safer? Mr. Patel's need to punish his perceived enemies is apparently greater than his interest in protecting the American people. Given the serious nature of these allegations and the need to protect the identities of my sources, I've asked the Department of Justice Inspector General today in a letter to investigate these specific claims. I believe they're true. Let the Inspector General make his own conclusion. I'll urge my Republican colleagues to please take these allegations seriously and at least pause for a moment and consider whether Kash Patel is the person you want to put in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 10 years. 10 years. If this man is so fast and loose with the truth before our committee now, imagine what he will do if given the protection of office. We need to pause in this consideration and consider what we already know about Mr. Patel. He has pledged to, quote, shut down FBI headquarters in writing and, quote, come after the president's enemies. He's even published the enemies list that he will target. I know, I've read it, and anybody can, in the book that he's published. He falsely claimed that the FBI, quote, was planning January 6th for a year, and has even sold musical recordings of a song performed by January 6 rioters who violently assaulted police officers on January 6. He's left behind a trail of grievances throughout his life, lashing out at anyone who dares to disagree with him or fails to respect him sufficiently. You want to give power to this man, the power of the investigation of the Federal Bureau of Investigation? I think not. Now these credible allegations that he has personally orchestrated a purge of senior FBI law enforcement officials. The FBI is an agency that plays a critical role in keeping us safe from terrorism, violent crime, narcotics, and other threats. Our nation needs an FBI director who understands the gravity of the mission, not someone who is focused on settling a political score. I yield. Yep. I yield.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
After the Gabbard nomination, the next issue up for consideration by the Senate is cloture on the Robert F. Kennedy nominee to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. This cabinet position is responsible for implementing the administration's health agenda. As Secretary, Mr. Kennedy must spend his time focused on improving the health of all Americans, ensuring HHS is transparent and accountable to congressional oversight, and respecting whistleblowers. I think Kennedy has made very clear in a life as a citizen talking about improving the health of all Americans. So I would like to outline some of the priorities that Mr. Kennedy should focus on at Health and Human Services. And obviously, I'm asking him to focus on things and issues that are very dear to my heart and take up a lot of my time as a senator from Iowa and a person very concerned about the quality health care in rural America. Our country spends more than $4.5 trillion annually on health care. Growing health care costs don't just strain Americans' pocketbooks. Health care is also a major driver of widening budget deficits and the federal government's unsustainable fiscal outlook. We're not getting our money's worth for all of that spending. Major health care program spending eats up 34% of the federal revenue today, and that will grow to 41% of revenue by 2055. Mr. Kennedy must, and I think he's committed to, ensuring that the key health programs, such as Medicare and Medicaid, are protected and strengthened by rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. The nominee must increase transparency and accountability. These actions will help make our healthcare system more efficient for the taxpayers and the consumers. I'm the author of major and more recent updates to the federal government's most powerful tool in fighting fraud, and that's people that use the False Claims Act. Since the enactment of this legislation, I'm talking about reforms to the False Claims Act, the federal government has recovered more than $78 billion lost to fraud and saved billions more by deterring would-be fraudsters. People in the Justice Department, both Republican and Democrats, say that the False Claims Act is their best tool to get after these fraudsters. In the 1 year of just 2024, and Attorney General Garland reported this to me just a couple days before he left office. In 2024, there was more than $2.9 billion in False Claims Act settlements and judgments, with $1.7 billion of it involving the healthcare industry. Now, as you know, I listen to a lot of whistleblowers, and whistleblowers were responsible for helping recover nearly all of that $1.7 billion. And I think I discussed the False Claims Act and the use of it by soon-to-be Secretary Kennedy. He seemed to be very enthused about listening to whistleblowers and use of the False Claims Act. And I think that he was probably being made aware of it for the first time. So I hope he will look into how he can use this act, and particularly by listening to reports from whistleblowers of the waste of taxpayers' money. Now, the Justice Department and HHS in combination need to more aggressively go after healthcare waste, fraud, and abuse, and empower and encourage whistleblowers. My top healthcare priority is lowering the cost of prescription drugs. We can start by putting more sunshine on pharmacy benefit managers' practices and holding these PBMs accountable. We should also establish price transparency on prescription drug TV ads. Knowing what something costs before buying it is just common sense and very helpful to the consumer. Transparency will bring more accountability and lower costs to consumers. Mr. Kennedy must also protect and improve access to rural health care. The previous administration dragged its feet in opening up spots for what is termed the Rural Community Hospital Demonstration Programs. HHS must also listen to the concerns from rural pharmacies and ensure rural hospitals benefit from additional physician slots that Congress has authorized. I look forward to strengthening the new and voluntary rural emergency program to ensure that it's working for rural communities, extending telehealth access, and supporting physicians getting a fair reimbursement under Medicare. I also expect HHS to support healthy moms and babies by improving care coordination and using telehealth in rural areas. HHS should work with me to support kids with complex medical needs so these kids and their families are getting the right care at the right time and at the right place. Our programs helping support kids with complex medical needs covers probably 6 or, well, depending on how many problems these kids have, but they have to navigate across several different programs. And what we're trying to do through legislation we pass is to have help so that when you have to see 5 or 6 different specialists, you have somebody saying what's available and what can we do to help you make access to all this. I also expect HHS to protect the most vulnerable and older Americans. I've spoken at length with Mr. Kennedy about some comments that he made in regard to agriculture. And I've heard from farmers in Iowa and agricultural organizations and commodity groups in the state fearful that Mr. Kennedy has some radical ideas on agriculture. At the end of the hour meeting I had with him in his office prior to his hearing before the Finance Committee, I was calmed quite a bit by what he told me about his views on agriculture. I hope that that calm can be maintained, but if it's not, Mr. Kennedy is sure to hear from me. So when we talked about this in my office, Mr. Kennedy prefaced our initial conversation by saying that he, as HHS Secretary, will not have jurisdiction over agricultural issues. So you can expect that I will expect him to leave agriculture practices regulations to the proper agencies, and for the most part, that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency. I've also sent letters to Secretaries of Agriculture and HHS requesting they provide information regarding conflicts of interest on dietary guideline advisory committees to increase transparency. The problem there is that there's a feeling among a lot of members of the advisory committee that they may have an unjustified conflict of interest in what they're suggesting we eat and the type of diet that we have. So I expect Mr. Kennedy to provide Congress with confidential financial disclosure from the advisory committee before finalizing dietary guidelines so that we know that nobody has a vested interest in however those guidelines are written. On issues of health care and agriculture, Mr. Kennedy said in his nomination hearing, I agree with all of those provisions. I'm quoting him now. I agree with all of those provisions, Senator, meaning this senator. My approach to the administration of HHS will be radical transparency. If a member of this committee or other members of the committee want information, the doors are open. If Congress asks me for information, you will get it immediately. Now, I don't know whether that's the end of the quote. I don't know whether people, even in the Senate here, but particularly people outside, know how refreshing it is to have a member of the cabinet say, if Congress asks me for information, you would get it immediately. Because over the years that I've been in the United States Senate, it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or Democrat administration, carrying out our constitutional responsibilities to see that the checks and balances, to see that the executive branch and the president faithfully executes the laws is not an easy process, and we have difficulty getting answers to our questions. Now, I don't know how much of this I've had trouble with HHS in the past, but I know when Pam Bondi came to my office, I showed her a file of 158 letters that I had written to the Justice Department in the last 4 years to get information and documents in regard to my investigations of wrongdoing. And most of them weren't answered, or if we got answers, it was nearly words on a sheet of paper, not very helpful. So thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for your promise, and I'm going to quote again, if Congress asks me for information, you will get it immediately, because that's what our job is. Every high school student learns in government about checks and balances of government, that we not only pass laws and we not only appropriate money, but we have a responsibility to the taxpayers and the citizens of this country to make sure that our president does what the Constitution says he should do, faithfully execute the laws. And cabinet people are bound by that same thing. Every cabinet member that comes to my office, I tell them about the importance of our constitutional responsibility of oversight, answering our letters, and listening to whistleblowers. And in regard to answering letters, everybody that comes before a committee is asked by the chairman of the committee, will you answer our letters? And everybody says yes. And I advise them to say maybe, so that they aren't turn out to be liars. So I expect Mr. Kennedy's agency to provide timely and complete responses to congressional oversight. Oversight allows us to hold bureaucrats accountable to the rule of law, and it helps keep faith with the taxpayers. So I look forward to working with Mr. Kennedy to improve the health of all Americans, make our healthcare system more efficient, and ensure HHS S's adherence to Kennedy's radical transparency commitment. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Senators are continuing work on President Trump's cabinet nominations. The next votes in the Senate will be on confirming Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence and on whether to advance RFK Jr.'s nomination to be HHS Secretary. Those votes happening overnight at 12:30 a.m. Eastern, unless there's a time agreement to hold them earlier. Other nominations in the queue for votes: Howard Lutnick to serve as Commerce Secretary, Brooke Rollins for Agriculture Secretary, and Kelly Loeffler to lead the Small Business Administration. And coming up this afternoon,
the state of Texas, Greg Abbott, has made a request to the United States Congress to reimburse our state for the expenses we've incurred in attempting to combat the Texas-Mexico border security crisis during the 4 years of the Biden administration. I'm proud to support this request along with my colleague Senator Cruz and members of the Texas delegation in the House of Representatives. Securing the nation's borders is the responsibility of the federal government, plain and simple. Given the division of responsibilities between the states and the federal government, there's no doubt but that this is a federal responsibility. For 4 years, though, President Biden and Vice President Harris and Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas intentionally and willfully refused to enforce the laws on the books to keep the border secure and to keep our nation safe. Even before his first day in the office, President Biden rolled out the welcome mat to illegal immigrants in speeches during his campaign, inviting what ensued. Early in his presidency, President Biden ended President Trump's very effective policy known as Remain in Mexico. This very simply provided that those who sought asylum needed to remain outside of the borders of the United States while their asylum claim was litigated and ultimately decided, knowing that only about 15% of people who claim asylum ultimately are awarded that by an immigration court. The Biden administration ended construction of President Trump's border wall and instead spent federal funds to store those materials that had already been paid for, squandering taxpayer dollars in the process. And as this crisis was evolving and worsening, President Biden ended Title 42 authorities, the COVID-era policy that was the last string in place helping to keep the lid on the illegal immigration crisis. So not only did the Biden administration turn a blind eye to what was an international responsibility and thus a federal government responsibility, they went a step further and actually actively enacted policies to make it worse. The Department of Homeland Security invited more illegal immigration when it created an app for your phone called the CBP One app, Customs and Border Protection app, which allowed migrants to literally schedule an appointment at a port of entry in order to illegally enter the United States. And of course, even if those who did not claim asylum were simply paroled or released into the interior along with a work permit. So here again, there was no matter of deterrence in saying, well, if you want to enter the United States, you need to do so according to the rules in an orderly basis. Essentially, all the rules were set aside, and the big green light and a welcome mat was laid out for anybody and everybody who wanted to come, and come they did. Tens of millions of people, we really don't know exactly how many, took advantage of this open border policy by the Biden administration. Let's say 10 million in round numbers. We know about 1.7 million people were gotaways, which is what the Border Patrol calls those who are evading law enforcement, who presumably are up to no good because they know they can't enter otherwise because they have either a criminal record or they're transporting drugs or engaged in some other illicit activity. At the same time that the Biden administration laid out the welcome mat to anybody and everybody who wanted to come to the United States across our border, they issued hundreds of millions of dollars in reimbursements to nonprofits and non-governmental organizations that helped facilitate this illegal immigration through FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program. So instead of meeting their responsibilities to secure the border, they essentially funded those organizations that facilitated it. Vice President Harris was assigned the task, as we know, of being the border czar to help manage this crisis. But she failed to even understand the assignment and failed utterly in completing that assignment. He visited the Texas-Mexico border once in sort of what I would call a drive-by during the 4 years that President Biden and Vice President Harris were in office. It's safe to say she had no concept or clue about what conditions were like on the border and how dangerous this open border policy was. But clearly she didn't care and was unwilling to do anything about it. On her one and only visit to the Texas border, she steered clear of the hot spots like the Rio Grande Valley, which is the very epicenter of the border crisis at the time. Instead, she went to El Paso for a sanitized, made-for-TV visit. Different parts of the border are very different. And instead of going to the place where she knew the action would be, she went to a place that was relatively calm, sedate. But she did it for a TV hit and no other reason. In 2024, when the Democratic Party deposed President Biden as their nominee and coronated Vice President Harris as their presidential candidate, she suddenly found herself campaigning to be president of the United States. But she actually shirked from the responsibilities that President Biden had given her as the border czar and claimed that she never was actually tasked to oversee the migration crisis. Suffice it to say that the Biden administration's handling of the border security was an unmitigated disaster. As a consequence, the state of Texas, which has 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, was basically left up to its own devices. We had no choice but to pick up the slack to try to secure some semblance of basic safety for Texans and the rest of the country. Everything the state of Texas did to fill the gap inured not just to the benefit of the 31 million people who live in Texas, but to the entire nation. Governor Abbott initiated something called Operation Lone Star, which resulted in the apprehension of more than 500,000 illegal immigrants by Texas law enforcement. Thanks to Operation Lone Star, law enforcement arrested more than 50,000 criminals trying to make their way across the border. Texas also built 240 miles of border barriers when the federal government refused to do its job. And officers across the country have seized more than 500 million deadly doses of fentanyl, which is the number one cause of death for young people between the age of 18 and 45 in this country. As a result of Operation Lone Star, without any help at all from the federal government, Texas was able to reduce illegal immigration into the state by 87%. Unfortunately, the state had to spend nearly $4.8 billion, again, on money that should have been provided by the federal government. Texas taxpayers had to foot the bill for $4.8 billion on walls and barriers, local grants to counties and cities, processing criminal arrests and moving migrants out of small Texas towns. The state also spent $3.6 billion to deploy the National Guard for building border barriers, guarding and constructing those barriers, and assisting Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection. Another $2.25 billion has gone toward personnel costs for Texas state troopers, law enforcement, who are responsible for repelling additional illegal immigrants, arresting those who were committing crimes, as well as transnational gang members, cartel members, human smugglers, and human traffickers. But this was just the start. There were costs associated with the prosecution of border crimes at Operation Lone Star's criminal processing centers. State game wardens had to pitch in to help patrol the Rio Grande River on the border to help prevent illegal entries. And criminal processing centers required health and safety services. We're all familiar with the saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. But President Biden and Vice President Harris failed to pony up for 4 years and then asked Texans to pick up the tab for their bill. All told, Governor Abbott and the state legislature had to spend more than $11 billion to make up for the Biden administration's blunders and malfeasance and nonfeasance when it came to border security and immigration. So it's not particularly complicated. Securing a country's borders is the function of the federal government. $11 billion is no small amount of money for a state, particularly one that doesn't have an income tax, to provide that benefits the rest of the country. But this is no different than when the federal government steps in to help states who have to deal with extraordinary expenses during the wake of a natural disaster, as they did for Texas in the case of Hurricane Harvey. But instead of a natural disaster, what we had during the 4 years of the Biden administration was a man-made disaster. While every state became a border state during the last administration, there are costs that Texas had to shoulder that our neighbors have not. It's just fair and right and just for Texas taxpayers to be made whole for the border security responsibilities it took on as a result of President Biden's dereliction of duty. So I'm proud to support Governor Abbott's request for the state to be reimbursed. My colleagues on the House and Senate Appropriations Committees should expect me and Senator Cruz and the entire Texas delegation to be strongly advocating for reimbursement for Texas in the coming weeks. And I look forward to working with them in order to make this a reality. As I yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama.
floor today to talk to you about President Trump's tariffs. The media is in full meltdown. They're in a full meltdown mode after President Trump imposed duties and retaliatory tariffs this week on countries that have basically been ripping the United States of America off. And they've been doing it for decades. Apparently, globalists and Democrats are just fine with other countries imposing tariffs on the United States. But when it comes to President Trump trying to equalize it up, establish a level playing field for domestic producers, well, that's a bridge too far. No one has been paying attention, President Trump. If they haven't been paying attention to President Trump, they should remotely not be surprised. He campaigned on this platform 3 times and has been crystal clear on his intentions. Now he is following through on his campaign promises. But in the corporate media, it seems to still be confused about all these tariffs. So let me spell it out. President Trump's view on tariffs, both a negotiating tool to get other countries to do a few things that we ask them to do, a way to boost American manufacturing and put American workers and businesses first, not last. President Trump has his work cut out for him after the disastrous 4 years for our small business and our corporation under the Biden administration. The Biden administration made it clear to our friends and foes alike that the globalist agenda would take precedent over the safety and well-being over the American people. Mind-boggling. Thankfully, those days are over. The American people gave President Donald J. Trump a clear mandate to restore our country's superpower status and put all Americans first, all businesses first, everybody that does something in this country. And that starts, number one, with securing our borders. Like I've said many times, if you don't have a border, you don't have a country. And we have really struggled in the last 4 years. That is changing. That's why the master negotiator in chief, President Donald Trump, threatened to impose 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada just the last couple of weeks. Over the last 4 years, the Mexican government just basically turned a blind eye while caravans of illegal aliens overran our borders. Coming from Mexico, coming from Central America, and all over the world, just overrunning our country. Thousands of women and children were trafficked, raped along the way. Drug cartels made an absolute fortune. Absolute fortune, not just with drugs, by the way, but for the payments of these illegals coming all the way through either Central America or South America to the United States with a big, basically, tariff of their own, charging these people to come to the United States. Lawlessness had become the status quo under President Biden. Nobody cared. Democrats in this room, they didn't care. They didn't care what was going on. Let's just let them all come in. Let's let the drugs come in. We lose 300 people pretty much every few days to illegal drugs in this country with overdoses. But let's don't worry about that. Let's just worry about controlling our country the way they wanted to. Well, it's been a disaster. Mexico showed zero signs of willingness to negotiate when President Trump took office. When he did take office, January the 20th, they woke up real quick. President Trump correctly understands that Mexico's economy is heavily dependent on the United States of America and the citizens of this country. In fact, more than 80% of Mexico's exports come to the United States. 80% come here. And the American citizens buy those products that are made in the United States. Mexico's economy would almost instantly feel the effects of a 25% tariff, leaving Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum no choice but to come to the negotiating table under the master negotiator, Donald Trump. So that's why he uses tariffs, to get his point across, because people across the world take us for granted. As a result, within hours of President Trump's announcement of the tariffs, Mexico caved. They saw real quick. Obviously, they're not stupid. They agreed to help the United States secure the border and crack down on the cartels and the illegal drugs coming in almost immediately, which we could have done the same thing with the past administration, but it just showed you they could care less of what happened at our border. Our neighbor to the north also caved to President Trump after a 25% tariff was threatened on Canada. Not only are illicit drugs like fentanyl coming into our country from Mexico, but there are also about 2,000% increase in drugs coming across the border in 2023 and 2024 from Canada. A 2,000% increase. In the last fiscal year alone, enough fentanyl was seized at the northern border to kill 9.8 million Americans. And to me, that would be a very serious problem. But do you think the Democrats cared? Nope. There was no action at all by the Biden administration on Canada. No action on Mexico. But thanks to President Trump's leadership, our North American neighbors from the north and south are making changes now daily that will protect American citizens from deadly drugs, criminals, and human traffickers. The number one job of the President of the United States is to protect the people in this country first, and that's what President Trump's doing. In addition to using tariffs as a negotiating tool, President Trump also views tariffs as a way to right the wrongs of past ineffective trade deals. That's why this week he's imposing a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports, including those of Canada and Mexico. Contrary to what the media is telling you, this isn't unprecedented. It's not unusual. In fact, President Trump has helped shine a light on the fact that U.S. exporters face higher tariffs than more than two-thirds of the time. We pay more tariffs than anybody. For example, among our major trading partners, China applies higher tariffs on 85% of U.S. products and 90% on U.S. and 90% on U.S. products from India. Just think about that. We are paying tariffs on things coming in this country, but when we send things out, we get the heck tariffed out of us from other countries. It's not fair trade. These exports imbalances don't just impact bottom lines, they also discourage domestic production. We have got to produce more in this country. We have got to build more things in this country, and that's what President Trump's trying to do. If we don't cut back on spending and start producing more in this country, this will not be the United States of America much longer, because we will be bankrupt, and we'll be reporting to somebody like China, who is buying our treasury bills right and left, or they were. One report conducted by the Department of Commerce in the first Trump administration found that excess production capacity, particularly China, has been a major factor in the decline of domestic aluminum production. Basically, we're getting overwhelmed by aluminum from China. That's not near as good as what we make in this country. President Trump built one of the strongest economies in a modern history in his first term. Modern history. But the Democrats failed to know that, so they wanted to change it. And did they ever? Almost destroyed our economy. Jobs and wages were up when President Trump was in. Inflation was down. Americans had more money in their pocket. And thanks to President Trump's strategic tariffs, along with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, companies were reshoring businesses back in the United States right and left. They were coming back because they could make profit. And that's what it's all about when you have a corporation. You got to make profit. And President Trump was able to, because of tariffs, make more money for manufacturing in this country going out of this country. You had companies like Ford canceling plans to build in Mexico back in President Trump's first term. and instead opening one in Michigan. This turned out to be extremely important when COVID hit, and we're forced to rely on goods manufactured right here in the United States. We found out pretty quick, just in drugs alone, we make very little drugs in the United States. Where they're made in India and China. They've got to come back here. We have to be self-sustaining. Whether it's our healthcare, technologies, agriculture products, or steel and aluminum, there's no reason for us to depend on other countries. We are the #1 country in this world, have been and will be in the future in manufacturing and production. America has some of the best and brightest manufacturers, best and brightest producers, farmers, and business. We take second to none. And from a national security perspective, it is dangerous to be reliant on other countries who may not have the best interest of the United States in mind. You can't blame them. They're looking out for themselves first. Well, we need to do the same thing. Not to mention the fact that U.S. produces the cleanest steel in the world. You'd think the Democrats and the climate cult would at least be happy about that. Think about that. You know, President Trump just put tariffs on steel and aluminum. A lot of the steel and aluminum come in, and because of how they make it, it's some of the dirtiest steel in the world. We make the cleanest. And why in the world would we want to import something that is going to be detrimental to our country alone with its environment? The tariffs being imposed this week are an important step in President Trump's plan to restore fairness, trade, boost domestic manufacturing, and put consumers and producers first. It's about time. 3 weeks into his presidency, President Trump is keeping his promises. President Trump's strategic tariffs will strengthen and revitalize our nation's economy, stop the flow of illicit drugs and illegal immigration, and make sure our trade deals are fair to both taxpayers and American manufacturers. America first. President Trump is utilizing every tool at his disposal as we speak, including tariffs to usher in the golden age of the American economy. We have to make that change. If we don't, we will not survive as the #1 country in the world. We will not regain that status, and we will be losing our national security. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I notice absent quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Senators are continuing work on President Trump's cabinet nominations. The next votes in the Senate will be on confirming Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence and on whether to advance RFK Jr.'s nomination to be HHS Secretary. Those votes happening overnight at 12:30 a.m. Eastern, unless there's a time agreement to hold them earlier. Other nominations in the queue for votes: Howard Lutnick to serve as Commerce Secretary, Brooke Rollins for Agriculture Secretary, and Kelly Loeffler to lead the Small Business Administration. And coming up this afternoon, a hearing on ways to modernize American healthcare by focusing on prevention, flexible insurance, and tech innovations. Health professionals and stakeholders will discuss the issue before the House Ways and Means Subcommittee on Health. That's live at 2 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3, C-SPAN Now, our free mobile video app, and online at cspan.org. Right now, here on C-SPAN 2, we're waiting for a senator to speak.
It's the hardware store, the grocery store. We've got to keep our rural communities going. Where the basic values that make America are still alive and well. And it's incumbent upon this committee to make sure that we strengthen the ag sector to make sure that rural America doesn't just survive, but grows and thrives. So thank you for having this hearing, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Vindman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, ranking member, and thank you to the witnesses for coming here today. I'd like to start by saying I'm excited to join the House Agriculture Committee, not only because this committee has a long history of bipartisanship, but also because Virginia's 7th District includes significant rural counties and contributes over 66,000 jobs and $9.7 billion to economic output in Virginia. As the only member from Virginia on the Agriculture Committee, I'm excited to represent farmers and ranchers across the Commonwealth. 2 weeks ago, I met with producers from around the district in Culpeper for a roundtable. We covered a lot of ground. Challenging economic pressures and weather events.
What's happening?
Extending the dairy margin coverage program past 2025, crop insurance programs, and updating our farm market development program to grow existing markets and reach new ones for farmers to sell their crops beyond traditional trade partners, and conservation programs, animal health in light of the avian flu, and so much more. I'm excited to tackle these challenges head on with my colleagues on this committee and to help producers back in my district. But if I had to pick a single unifying factor in my conversations with farmers to bring here today, it's lack of certainty. Farmers face enough challenges each day without their government making them guess what tomorrow will bring. Will we pass a farm bill that updates practices and payment rates that are becoming more and more out of date as input costs rise? Will government tackle labor shortages or let another year go by while costs go up? Will there or won't there be a trade war with our northern and southern neighbors, our biggest trading partners, that makes it harder for farmers to find markets to sell their crops? The way I see it, the committee has 3 key responsibilities: ensure that American families don't go hungry, American consumers are able to access high-quality food at reasonable prices, and that family farmers and ranchers across America have stable economies so they can succeed. Without question, food security is national security. Yesterday, my local paper, the Washington Post, published an article outlining how farmers across the country are facing significant budget gaps after USDA froze payments on a range of programs. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to enter the following Washington Post article into the record.
Without objection.
One of the president's first executive orders was to freeze congressionally appropriated funds from the Inflation Reduction Act. However, when farmers sign up for programs, they often are required to front a percentage of the costs. A few examples. A flour farmer in Maryland signed a contract for USDA to cover half of a $72,900 solar panel installation. She's already on the hook for a loan she took out to cover the other half. A cattle farmer in eastern Missouri signed a $240,000 contract in December under the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, pronounced EQIP, and had already spent $80,000 on fencing and a well that he expected to be partly paid back by USDA. Mr. Weinzierl, in your testimony, you outlined that input costs are rising while commodity prices remain break-even at best. With farmers already operating on tight margins, what do you think will happen to farmers, or when farmers who budgeted carefully, who made deals with the U.S. government, and who spent their own money to keep their end of the bargain, what will happen to these farmers if the U.S. government reneges on that deal by freezing their funds? Do the banks care if the USDA has frozen funding, or are farmers still liable?
Well, if farmers have signed a contract or have already expensed the money, they are on the hook for that spending. So hopefully, the uncertainty goes away and we move forward on reimbursement. It really will depend on how, using the term wounded, that farm family is relative to what they've been losing over the last couple years relative to what the extent of the impact is going to be.
And just briefly, do you anticipate, even if the freeze is lifted in 90 days, that there are still bills to pay during that period of time, or projects that are put on hold? Is that going to have an effect on farmers?
I would expect most of them to have good lenders backing them. Those relationships have probably been long-term, and I would expect most of them to be able to maintain their current equity position on those projects.
Thank you, Mr. Weinzierl. It's clear that current policy is only increasing uncertainty and making it harder for farmers to make ends meet. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Weed from Wisconsin.
I think we can all agree that many conversations we have as Americans in recent years is how can we become healthier as a country? Becoming more healthy citizens needs to start with having access to the most highly nutritious, high-quality American-grown food. Ensuring the American farm economy is strong will help ensure that we are raising healthier families and protecting national security. We cannot make America great again without making sure those feeding America are supported in their mission. As a former business owner, I know firsthand that costly inputs and uncertainty elsewhere can cause strain and stress. Not knowing if you'll be able to continue operating a business that has lasted generations, let alone passing it down to the next generation, is not a position I envy. I look forward to beginning my work on this committee and learn how we can provide our American farmers and ranchers more certainty in a rough agriculture economy so that they can plant the seeds for us to make the healthiest decisions for our Americans and families, and ultimately make American agriculture great again. I would like to thank the chair for putting on this hearing today and all the witnesses for sharing more about your operations today. So quick question, Dr. Newton, just tell me about exports. Is that something that, are we in a deficit, surplus? What's the state of exports as it relates to Canada, Mexico, China, and otherwise?
Absolutely, and fantastic question. Number one, Mexico is our top agricultural export market. Canada's number 2, China's number 3. You round out the top 6 with Japan, South Korea, and the European Union. But agricultural exports have fallen sharply over the last few years. We're now in a situation where for fiscal year 2025, we're projected to have an agricultural trade deficit of nearly $46 billion. That's the largest trade deficit in agriculture's history. But we had record agricultural exports in 2022, largely on the back of record purchases by the Chinese under the Phase 1 agreement, USMCA that was renegotiated, and the renegotiated agreement with Japan all contributed to very, very strong agricultural exports several years ago.
So what has happened in these last 2 years?
Well, the value of our agricultural products, as we're in this current downturn in the farm economy with lower corn prices, lower cotton prices, that's contributed to a lower value of our agricultural exports. At the same time, agricultural imports continue to set new records every single year. We're importing, spirits, imported beers, horticultural products. Americans want year-round access to fruits and vegetables. So our agricultural imports, I believe, I don't have.
Okay, you guys, I'm going to have to be moving on. I got a lot of things to do, and we will come back again in the future. Hopefully they won't have something that's like at 12 o'clock midnight. I hate when they do that, 12 o'clock midnight stuff. Anyway, see ya all in the future. Be on the lookout for more videos and live streaming of games and jokes I air.
Cut to the bone by the man on the throne. Big boss man saying, give them the can. Big head got finger in our stuff. Knows he's super rich, gotta make life rough. Both hands on the rug, then he starts to tug. Grandma and Pa get scared, give him a hug. You got flam, big boss man. Toss you in a garbage can. Big boss man. Toss you in a garbage can. Big head guy paid high for a golden key. That's not an option for you or me. With an unelected shortcut and everything in sight, gonna cut it to the bone. Fuck it if it's wrong or right. You got blam, blam, big boss man. Toss you in the garbage can. Big boss man. Toss you in the garbage can. You hear it on TV and the radio. FBI agents get fired, they get let go. The guys who investigated Big Boss Man get their names, make excuse, give them the can. You had a chance and thought really hard. Shall I stand behind a bucket of lies? Standing behind you, got your neck deep. You got suckered by a world-class creep. Holler and yell, ringing warning bells. Politician screams, you go down. Nothing gets done except for the screaming. People left wondering while getting the ring. You got blam, blam. Big boss man. Toss you in a garbage can. Big boss man. Toss you in a garbage can.